So what's up everybody, we're back in BFA with another Stankie video, and today we're taking a look at Heroic Gahun. So I'll be going over what you need to know about the encounter and what kind of tactic we use to bring it down. So let's jump straight in. Before we start talking about the boss fight itself, we need to talk about the platforms, or the Gauntlet if you will. Throughout Phase 1 and Phase 2, you need to deal with these so-called gauntlets. The goal is simple: pick up an orb and deliver it at the end. Doing this 3 times will trigger a reorigination blast, which stuns all enemies including Gahun, increases their damage taken by 100% for 24 seconds, and on top of this it deals a bunch of damage to all enemies and Gahun. And this is a key part of the fight, and it's the only way to get to Phase 2 and eventually Phase 3. So at the start of the gauntlet, or the platforms, whatever you want to call it, there's a power matrix, or an orb as I will say. There's one on either side of the room, and only one will be up at a time in both normal and heroic. Starting with the left side at the start of the encounter and at the start of Phase 2, otherwise it just alternates between left and right. You will need at least 2 players to clear the gauntlet. Some classes, if done properly, can solo it if they have a gateway, but the safest way is just to bring 2 highly mobile classes to get it done as fast as possible. All in all, you need between 6 and 8 teams, depending on how much DPS you have, to be able to get to Phase 3. And this is due to the imperfect physiology debuff, which means any player who's picked up the orb is unable to pick up a new orb for 5 minutes, which means you need a few teams to actually finish it. In Phase 1 you can use any combination of classes or players, even tanks can do it, but for Phase 2 you want to have at least 1 DPS and 1 healer doing it. And this is mainly due to Phase 2 having a lot of constant damage and dots ticking, which could lead to the unfortunate demise of said player during the gauntlet if left without a healer. So let's talk about the gauntlet itself. At the start of the gauntlet there's an interactable orb which you need to pick up, and doing so will progressively slow you until you can no longer move. You can however throw the orb on the ground, which creates a swirl effect, and another player can stand in this swirl to pick up the orb. If no player stands where the swirl is, the orb is lost and the gauntlet is over. And along the path of the gauntlet there's a lot of cysts with a white web around them if you will, and if you touch these your movement speed will be greatly reduced. However, if you DPS the cysts, they will shrink in size. So to deal with this in the simplest way possible is the following. When the first player gets ready to pick up the orb, the second player in your gauntlet group should already be a bit ahead DPSing cysts to clear a path for the first player. Have a gateway a few yards from where you pick up the orb. The player with the lower mobility in any gauntlet group should pick up the orb, use the gateway, and as soon as you land you use any movement ability like leap, tiger dash, fell rush, etc, to get as far as you can. And after you've had the orb for 10 seconds, you can no longer move. However, you can still teleport with blink and such, but you can no longer dash or leap or anything like that. The second player should stand ready to catch the orb whenever the first player throws it. And when the second player catches the orb, he just uses whatever he has to get all the way to the reorigination drive. Click it to turn in the orb and you're done. Takes a bit of setup and practice to get used to it, but once you're used to it, it's really simple. And in order to get to Phase 2 you need to turn in 3 orbs, or 3 gauntlets. So let's take a look at what happens in the so-called arena during the fight. Throughout all phases you need to deal with something called explosive corruption. It targets random members in the raid, tanks included, and after 4 seconds you drop a patch on the ground and you spawn a couple of white orbs. The patch deals damage and slows, and the orbs gives anyone who gets hit the explosive corruption debuff, meaning if it goes off in the wrong place it can very easily cause a wipe very fast. What you need to do is simply, as soon as you get it, start running towards a wall and try and drop it as far away as possible. This is easier said than done, but as long as you get away a bit, it's usually okay, but dropping one in the middle of the raid is, well, probably a wipe. Most of us in my guild simply use weak auras to track this both visible and audible to make sure we don't miss it. So let's take a look at Phase 1. In Phase 1 you don't fight Gahun, just his little friends in the arena. You have the Cyclopean Terror, the Dark Young, and the Blight Spreader Tendril. The Cyclopean Terror have a few set spawn location, they can't be tanked or move, and they need to be interrupted and killed as soon as possible. They are stunnable and the like, so just make sure to interrupt and stun them as often as possible. Moving on to the Dark Young ad, it needs to be picked up by a tank and moved around to a few key locations. He has a frontal smash which needs to be aimed away from other players, and he has a spell called Dark Bargain. Dark Bargain is a 10-yard AoE around the Dark Young, and any creature hit, including players, will take 25% increased damage and get 25% increased healing and damage done. But if you take 2 in a row, you get mind control, so utilizing this to ease up the encounter is key for phase 1. So whichever tank who's tanking the Dark Young should move it to where the Cyclopean Terrors are at the beginning to debuff them, and as soon as Dark Bargain has been cast, the tank needs to move it to where the new Terrors will spawn to debuff them. Players will want to alternate which bargain they take, and we found that simply taking the very first one and alternating after that to be the most effective. So in short, 1, 3, 5, and so on. When he casts Bargain, he becomes immobilized, so the tank can move out of it without any problems, so there's no risk of mind control. Shortly after his third Dark Bargain, a Blight Spreader Tendril will spawn, which will need to be tanked by whichever tank isn't tanking the Dark Young. It needs to be focused down and interrupted at all time. So phase 1 is mainly about doing the 3 gauntlets fairly fast and not getting overrun by Cyclopean Terrors, and making sure not to blow up the raid with explosive corruptions. If you manage to get the 3 gauntlets done fast, there's no need at all to DPS the Dark Young. The Reorigination Blast from the 3rd gauntlet will kill it while you transition into phase 2. So mainly focus on the Terrors and the Blight Spreader and just use the Dark Young as your personal buffer. Moving on, as soon as you've turned in the 3rd orb in phase 1, phase 2 starts with a big blast. You want your raid to stack up due to heavy AoE damage so that your healers will have an easier time to top you off. Shortly after, Gauntlet itself will crawl out of the, well, you know what it looks like in the wall, and phase 2 starts. And as soon as Gehun crawls out of the wall, the first phase 2 gauntlet team should run up to their gauntlet, which is the left one, and get ready to start. Your tanks want to pick up Gehun and tank it against a wall due to explosive corruption, so they can leave their patches against the wall and have plenty of space to move the boss if needed. For you tanks out there, whenever Gehun attacks a tank, it deals both its normal swing damage and a bit of plague damage from Corrupting Bite. It also gets a stack of Growing Corruption every time it attacks, increases his damage done with Corrupting Bite by 15%. On top of this, whichever tank is currently tanking Gehun when he casts Explosive Corruption will also be the one that gets the debuff. Knowing this, you can either tank swap whenever one tank gets Explosive Corruption, which results in higher stacks on Gehun and easier Explosive Corruption management, or you can just taunt it around 4 stacks, take less damage, but it will also make Corruption management a bit trickier. We ended up just swapping whenever a tank got Corruption, bit more damage taken, but far less boss movement and weird corruption drops. The rest of the raid should aim to be loosely spread around the boss, and this is due to the new ability called Wave of Corruption. It deals a moderate amount of damage to everyone and triggers an explosion around anyone hit. The wave itself is unavoidable, so just stay spread. Anytime you get hit by the wave, you get a stack of putrid blood, which deals a bunch of damage and stacks. Get too many and, well, you'll die. Which leads us to the next ability called Blood Feast. Blood Feast targets a random member and immobilizes him for 6 seconds. Any player within 8 yards of that target will have their putrid blood stacks removed and an ad will spawn. So you want any and all raid members, including your tanks, to stack close to the Blood Feast target so they can remove all their stacks, bit like the last boss in Underrot. The exception to this is obviously if you have Explosive Corruption on you. If that's the case, do not, I repeat, do not stack on the Blood Feast target. That is 100% a wipe. There is no recovery from that. Moving on, as I said, when the putrid blood stacks are removed from Blood Feast, one big ad will spawn, the Gibbering Horror. This ad needs to be picked up by whichever tank isn't tanking Gehun and should be tanked next to Gehun for cleaving. Tanks should during this swap tanking target, meaning if you aren't tanking the boss, you tank the ad and vice versa. Early on, however, it is far easier to have 3 tanks for this particular part of the fight due to both the ad and the boss hitting like trucks on steroids. The Gibbering Horror will cast an ability called Mind Numbing Shatter, and it works a bit like Quaking, so if you're casting something when it goes off, you will be interrupted and silenced for 3 seconds, so just keep an eye out for that. So how do we deal with all of this? Well, your DPS can actually ignore the ad. Passive cleave is fine, but anything beyond that is overkill. Your third Gauntlet team in phase 2 will want to wait with delivering the orb until the second ad spawns. So as soon as the second Blood Feast goes out, everyone stacks in it, clears their Putrid Blood debuff, you pop Bloodlust, and when the ad spawns, you deliver the third orb. This will leave you with 24 seconds of 100% damage taken increase on the boss and the ads during Bloodlust. The ads will die from the blast itself, and you're free to just tunnel Gahun as much as you want. If you have enough DPS, you will reach 20%, which is phase 3. If you're unable to get Gahun lower than around 24-25% with Bloodlust here, I recommend you instead save Bloodlust for phase 3 and do one more rotation of Gauntlets. If you go for one more rotation of Gauntlets in phase 2, you still want to time the Origination Blast with a Blood Feast so that you can clear all of your stacks of Putrid Blood before you get into phase 3. When we killed it, we went for Bloodlust in phase 2 during the first Origination Blast and just got it down to 20%. We simply made sure we had cooldowns up for that part, pop Bloodlust, second battle pot, and nuked like never before. This saved a lot of mana for the healers, and in all fairness, phase 3 isn't that challenging if you do this correctly. So moving on, phase 3 starts when Gahun reaches 20%, and it starts up with the boss being invulnerable. A few collapses will happen, they're indicated by the huge circles on the ground, and well, you don't want to be standing in those. And during phase 3, the re-origination device is broken, so you no longer need or will be able to do the Gauntlet, so this phase is simply a burn phase. The new mechanic here is the malignant growths. So these will spawn all over the arena floor, they will grow in size, and after a few seconds they will explode. Standing in one will result in your death. So make sure not to stand in them. As soon as they spawn, look for a safe spot, keep track of which growths are going to explode next. As soon as one pops, move to that location and you'll be safe. Make sure to stay spread from other players during this due to the wave of corruption, so find a safe space but try and be spread. Another mechanic in phase 3 is also the Gaze of Gahun. Works pretty much like any blind boss mechanic, but it's a fear instead. So when Gahun casts its gaze, turn your back against it and you won't be feared. Tanks still need to keep track of growing corruption stacks, and everyone still needs to be on their toes due to explosive corruption, and the raid should still aim to be loosely spread due to the waves. Otherwise, phase 3 is all about staying alive and burning down the boss. It's a very healing intense phase, and it might take a couple of tries to figure out how to dodge the growths, but other than that, you shouldn't face too many problems in phase 3. So a quick recap, if you made it this far, make 6 or 8 teams of 2 for the Gauntlets. Phase 1 should be at least 2 DPS per team, a tank works as well. Phase 2 should be 1 DPS, 1 healer per team, ideally but not mandatory. In phase 1, don't get overrun by Cyclopean terrors and use the Dark Young to buff debuff stuff during phase 1. Focus and interrupt the Blight Spreader when it spawns, make sure to run out if you get explosive corruption, and when the third orb is turned in, stack during the intermission. In phase 2, you want to stay loosely spread until Blood Feast and stack on that target to remove your Putrid Blood stacks. Make sure you don't stack with explosive corruption, ignore the ad, and make sure to turn in the third orb as soon as the second ad spawns. Pop Bloodlust, burn Gahun, and go into phase 3. In phase 3, you still want to stay loosely spread, avoid the growths, turn your back on Gahun when it casts Gaze of Gahun, and make sure to run out with explosive corruption and nuke. And, well, that's pretty much it for Gahun Heroic. Hope this helped you out, and if you have any questions at all, make sure to hit me up in the comments below. And as always, hit that subscribe button, leave me a like, and ring that notification bell and switch it to all. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.